It was a little after 7:15 a.m. when I noticed the garage door was open. The morning light spilled in softly, pale and quiet, touching the rim of the coffee cup in my hand. The coffee had gone cold. I hadn't taken a sip since I sat down. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close it the night before. But then the chill in my chest began to creep in. Something was wrong. I stepped outside, my slippers brushing against the damp driveway. The air smelled like rain that never came. The garage was empty. The space where the 1969 Mustang had always sat. My husband's pride. My last connection to him was bare. For a second, I thought maybe Daniel had taken it for a drive. He used to beg his father to let him behind the wheel when he was 16. But Daniel hadn't touched that car since the funeral. He knew better. He knew what it meant. I felt my breath catch. That car wasn't just a piece of metal and paint. It was my husband's laughter. His stubbornness. His hands that built and rebuilt it through decades of love and patience. I could still see him wiping the hood with that same red cloth every Sunday morning, saying it looked best when the world was quiet. I ran my hand along the empty workbench, fingertips brushing against the outline of where his tools once hung. My reflection wavered in the silver of a forgotten wrench, and for a moment, I saw both of us there. Him behind me, smiling. Then the memory fractured. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the stillness. Daniel's car pulled up. Slow. Hesitant. He stepped out, eyes darting toward the empty space before he even looked at me. That silence between us said everything. In that instant, my grief turned into something heavier. Something that didn't belong to love. It felt like betrayal. Sharp and quiet. Blooming in the same place my sorrow used to live. And that's when I realized the story of my husband's Mustang wasn't just about what was missing. It was about what had been taken. And by whom. Before everything changed, life had a rhythm. Simple, quiet, and steady. Every Sunday morning, my husband, Tom, would pull that old 1969 Mustang into the driveway and spend hours polishing it until the blue paint gleamed like water under sunlight. I'd watch from the porch, coffee in hand, as he hummed along to his favorite songs from the 70s. That car wasn't just his hobby, it was our history. He had bought it the year we married, promising me that one day, we'd take it across the country when the kids were grown. We never did. Life, work, and time got in the way. But every time I saw that car, I remembered that promise and the life we built together. After he passed, the house grew impossibly still. The radio in the kitchen went silent. The laughter that used to fill these rooms disappeared. Even the ticking clock on the wall felt too loud. Grief has a strange way of hollowing out the air, leaving you surrounded by everything you once loved, yet unable to feel any of it. I'd catch myself standing in the garage, tracing the Mustang's curves with my fingers, whispering small things to him as if he could still hear me. Some nights, I'd sit behind the wheel just to smell the worn leather, hoping it could bring him back. Even for a moment. Daniel tried. At first, he'd come by on weekends, check in, fix small things around the house. He had his father's eyes. Kind, thoughtful, but growing tired. After his wedding, though, something shifted. He stopped lingering. Our conversations became shorter, colder. His wife, Clara, was polite but distant. The kind of person who smiled without warmth. I tried to make her feel welcome. To believe that maybe the unease I felt was just loneliness twisting my thoughts. But sometimes, when she'd glance at the Mustang, there was a look in her eyes. Something sharp. Assessing. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself families evolve. that love stretches to fit new shapes. But in the quiet corners of my mind, I began to sense a space opening. Not just the space Tom left, but one between me and Daniel. It grew slowly, silently, like a crack beneath paint. And now, as I think back on it, I realize how betrayal doesn't always start with anger or lies. Sometimes, it begins with distance. A soft drift you barely notice until the person you love most feels like a stranger standing in your own doorway. It happened the next afternoon. Daniel showed up unannounced, his face pale, his voice thin, and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I didn't need him to speak. I could feel the truth already pressing against the air between us. Still, when the words came, it was as if they scraped the inside of my chest raw. He had sold the Mustang. My husband's car. The car I'd spent years protecting, polishing, and holding on to because it was all I had left of him. Gone. Just like that. At first, I didn't react. My body went cold. It felt like someone had turned down the volume of the world. His voice was there, explaining, rationalizing, but it came through like sound underwater. He said something about needing money, about Clara's trip to Paris, about how it was only a car. Only a car. That phrase looped in my mind like a cruel echo. To him, maybe that's all it ever was. But to me, it was a heartbeat. A promise. The ghost of Sunday mornings filled with laughter and sunlight. I remember staring at the spot on his shirt where a button was missing, because looking at his face was too painful. My son, the boy who once washed that Mustang with his father, who used to trace the curves of the steering wheel and call it Dad's treasure, now looked at me with impatience, as if I were the one who didn't understand. He spoke like a man doing the practical thing, as if love could be replaced with logic, as if memories could be priced and traded. And then there was Clara. She stood behind him, arms crossed, expression smooth and unbothered. She didn't even try to pretend regret. In her eyes, it was just an old vehicle. Something outdated. Inconvenient. Unnecessary. She smiled faintly when she mentioned how the money would help them breathe a little. That smile, so polished, so hollow, felt like salt in a wound I didn't even know I had left. I wanted to scream, to demand how they could take something so sacred, but instead, I just sat down. My knees felt weak, my voice too fragile to carry the weight of what I felt. I realized in that moment that betrayal doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in explanations that make sense to everyone but you. I tried to listen as Daniel spoke. I tried to find the boy I raised, somewhere in his words. But all I heard was a stranger's tone. All I saw was a man I didn't recognize anymore. When he reached out to touch my hand, I couldn't bring myself to move. I just stared at the space between us. The gap where love used to live. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps in the garage. Every gust of wind reminded me of the door swinging open to nothing. I kept thinking of Tom's hands, grease-stained, patient, and how he used to say that some things can't be fixed once broken. And as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I realized he was right. Something precious had been taken. Not just the car, but the trust that bound this family together. And there, in that stillness, grief turned into something heavier, a quiet, hollow ache that no apology could ever fill. I didn't sleep that night. The house felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was grieving with me. Every sound echoed. The hum of the refrigerator, the slow tick of the clock, the faint rustle of tree branches outside. I sat in the living room until the sky began to pale, my thoughts circling like restless birds. There was no peace. Only the dull ache of something I couldn't undo. When the phone rang at 7 a.m., the sound startled me. It cut through the silence like a sharp crack in still water. For a moment, I thought it was Daniel calling to apologize, but the number on the screen was unfamiliar. I hesitated before answering. The man's voice on the other end was calm, low, and steady, carrying the kind of politeness that comes from habit, not obligation. He introduced himself as Tom Harris. Said he owned a small classic car dealership just outside of town. Then he said something that made my heart stop. He told me he had my husband's Mustang. I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, unsure if I'd heard him right. He explained that a young man had come by the previous day, my son, and sold the car. But before finalizing the paperwork, Tom ran the VIN and saw my husband's name. He paused then, as if weighing whether to tell me more. Finally, he said he knew Tom Lewis. My Tom. A long time ago. They had served together briefly, back when they were both still trying to figure out who they were. He said my husband once did something for him that changed his life. Something he never forgot. There was a quiet warmth in his voice when he spoke about him. A kind of reverence that caught me off guard. He said he'd kept the car overnight. Uneasy about the sale. Something about it felt wrong. When he looked inside the glove compartment, he found an envelope addressed to me. In my husband's handwriting. My breath caught when I heard that. After all these years. After losing so much. To think there was still something left from him. It didn't feel real. Tom told me he hadn't opened it. Said it wasn't his place. He just wanted to return the car to where it belonged. He asked if I could come by the shop that morning. I didn't even think before agreeing. As I hung up, the first rays of sunlight spilled through the window, brushing against the old photographs on the wall. The ones of us laughing beside that Mustang decades ago. I pressed my palm to the glass and whispered his name. I'm not sure if I was ready for what I might find. But certain of one thing, this wasn't the end of the story. Somehow, through all the loss and betrayal, Tom had found a way to reach me again. Tom's garage sat on the edge of town, tucked behind a row of rust-colored warehouses that hadn't changed in decades. When I stepped out of the car, the air smelled faintly of oil and rain, soaked asphalt. Inside, the light was soft and golden, filtering through dusty windows that caught the shimmer of chrome and steel. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in. The hum of tools, the faint murmur of a radio playing an old song from another time. It all felt familiar, painfully so. The scent of engine grease, the faint warmth of exhaust. They carried me back to those long weekends when Tom would lose himself in that same rhythm. Half mechanic, half artist. And then I saw it. The Mustang. My husband's car. Shining softly under the garage lights. A little bruised, but still beautiful. It looked alive again. As if it had been waiting for me. My knees almost gave out when I saw the old leather seats. The same worn steering wheel I'd seen him grip thousands of times. I placed my hand on the hood. And it was warm. Like the car itself remembered me. Tom Harris came over quietly, wiping his hands with a rag. His presence was steady. The kind of calm that doesn't demand words. He said he hadn't touched a thing since finding the envelope. He opened the driver's door and gestured to the dashboard. There, tucked just beneath the glove compartment, was a small metal latch I had never noticed before. When he pressed it, a hidden compartment popped open with a soft click. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges. My name written in Tom's handwriting, to the same looping letters that used to mark every note he'd leave me on the fridge. I felt my hands tremble as I took it. The paper was cool, fragile, like it had been waiting too long. Alongside it lay a small brass key tied with a faded red ribbon. I didn't know what it opened yet, but I could feel its weight. Not just physical, but emotional. almost sacred. I sat down in the passenger seat before opening the letter. The world outside went quiet. Like even the air was listening. His handwriting carried me back instantly. Steady. Firm. Full of care. Reading his words felt like hearing his voice echo through time. He wrote that he had grown suspicious of Clara months before he passed. That she wasn't who she claimed to be. He had discovered debts, hidden accounts, and a history of manipulation that stretched farther than our family knew. But he hadn't wanted to burden me while he was sick. Instead, he had gathered everything. Documents, statements, and recordings, and locked them away in a safety box registered under my name. He told me that the brass key would open it. My heart broke and healed in the same breath as I read on. His words were gentle, but beneath them was a quiet strength. A man who had loved deeply enough to protect even after death. He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the truth had found its way to me at last. That no matter what our son chose, I deserved peace. And that he trusted me to do what was right. By the time I reached the end, my tears had already soaked through the paper. But they weren't just from sadness anymore. They were from awe. From realizing that love doesn't fade when life ends. It lingers in the spaces we don't see. In the things left unsaid. In the ways the living are still guided by the dead. I looked up at Tom Harris then. The real one. Who stood a few feet away with quiet respect. He said he didn't know what was in the letter. But he could tell it meant something sacred. I nodded. Unable to speak. And whispered a silent, "Thank you." To him. To my husband. To whatever hand of fate had brought me here. When I left the garage, the morning light had grown stronger. I held the key tightly in my palm. For the first time since my husband's death, I didn't feel small or broken. I felt chosen. Trusted. That day, I stopped being the woman who lost everything. I became the woman carrying a truth her husband died to protect. The brass key felt heavier than it should have. Small enough to fit in my palm. Yet carrying the weight of every secret my husband had buried for me to find. The next morning, I drove to the bank downtown. The one we'd used for years but that I hadn't stepped into since his funeral. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Everything was too bright. Too sterile. My hands trembled as I slid the key across the counter to the clerk. She led me into a private room lined with gray metal boxes, each one holding a lifetime's worth of someone else's memories. When the lock clicked open, a strange calm settled over me. Inside the safe deposit box was a neatly folded envelope with my name. Another marked attorney copy. A small stack of stock certificates. And a thick folder sealed with a red string. There was also a flash drive, labeled simply with my husband's initials. I sat there for a long moment before reaching for any of it, afraid that touching the truth would make it too real. The documents told a story that made my stomach twist. My husband had traced Clara's past for months before his illness worsened. A trail of false identities, bankrupt ventures, and broken families. There were receipts, forged signatures, and even letters she'd written under another name. And among the papers was the proof that he had quietly moved $300,000 into a protected trust under my name, shielded from anyone's reach. It wasn't about money. It was about protection. Later that afternoon, I called the number written in the corner of his note. Frank Coleman. Retired. When he answered, his voice carried the steady confidence of someone who had seen too much of life to be surprised by anything. He told me he'd once worked with my husband, that he'd helped him gather the evidence, but had promised not to come forward unless I reached out myself. He confirmed everything. Clara's manipulation. Her pattern of finding widowers and isolating their children, always leaving when the money ran dry. Hearing it out loud felt like a wound reopening. But beneath the ache was a slow burning clarity. My husband hadn't been paranoid. He had been preparing me for this very moment. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the kitchen in gold. I sat at the table where we used to eat dinner together. I placed the folder beside a plate. Untouched. I thought about Daniel. My sweet, trusting boy. Now a man so desperate to build his own life that he couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. The thought of shattering that illusion made my heart ache. But love, I realized, isn't about sparing someone pain. It's about giving them the truth, even when it cuts deep. I decided to invite them both to dinner the next night. I cooked his favorite meal, just like when he was a child. Roast chicken with rosemary and mashed potatoes. I set the table carefully, every motion deliberate, like a ritual of goodbye. The silence between each breath was filled with what I already knew was coming. When they arrived, Clara's perfume filled the room first. Sharp and floral. The kind that lingers, even after she's gone. She smiled too brightly, complimenting the food, pretending warmth. Daniel seemed lighter, unaware of the storm beneath the surface. I watched them both closely, the candlelight flickering against their faces. The contrast between innocence and deceit had never been clearer. As I poured the wine, I felt the strength in my husband's words settle inside me. The evidence was ready, the truth undeniable. But I also knew this wasn't just about exposing lies. It was about saving what little remained of my family. That night, when the dishes were cleared and the laughter faded, I sat alone at the table and whispered into the quiet. I told my husband I was ready. Ready to do what love demanded. Even if it broke me. Because sometimes love isn't soft or forgiving. Sometimes it's a reckoning. It was past midnight when the phone rang. I remember staring at the glowing screen. Daniel's name trembling in the dark. His voice on the other end was shaking. The kind of sound that breaks a mother's heart before the words even form. He said he'd found everything. The bank records, the forged documents, the debts Clara had hidden in his name. He kept saying he didn't understand how it happened. How he let it happen. As he spoke, I could hear the truth unraveling in his mind, thread by painful thread. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, holding the silence the way I used to hold him when he was a child. Part of me wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but another part knew this was his moment to see. Really see what love and trust can cost when given to the wrong person. Not long after we hung up, Frank Coleman called. His voice was low but urgent. Clara had tried to access a private account under a false identity. Airport cameras had caught her hours earlier. One suitcase in hand. Ticket to Paris in the other. The same city she'd once claimed she dreamed of visiting for their honeymoon renewal. I felt my pulse quicken. But I didn't panic. There was a strange calm inside me. The kind that comes when the storm finally breaks. And you realize you've already survived the worst of it. Daniel met me at the edge of the airport parking lot before dawn. His face was pale, eyes swollen. The kind of emptiness that only betrayal can carve into a person. The flashing blue and red lights painted us both in fragments of color as police moved in near the terminal. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Through the glass doors, we saw her. Clara. Her polished coat. Her perfect hair. The same calm mask she'd worn at our table just the night before. Only now, her eyes darted from side to side, searching for an escape that didn't exist. When the officers approached her, I felt no triumph, just an ache. Not for her, but for the man beside me. My son stood motionless as they led Clara away. Her fury barely contained. Her words sharp and empty. He turned toward me slowly. And in that moment, all the anger, confusion, and heartbreak collapsed into quiet understanding. He didn't need my forgiveness. He needed truth. And he finally had it. The next few days blurred together. Police reports, statements, the endless retelling of what my husband had already foreseen. The evidence he'd gathered was airtight, Meticulous. Even merciful. Frank called it poetic justice. I called it love. My husband hadn't been trying to punish anyone. He'd been trying to save us. To make sure I'd never be left defenseless again. Daniel moved back home for a while. At first, we barely spoke. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't the same kind of silence I'd known before. This one had hope in it. The quiet kind that waits patiently for healing. Some evenings, I'd find him sitting in the garage, staring at the Mustang like it was a monument to everything he'd lost and everything he'd learned. One night, he asked if he could restore it, piece by piece, in his father's memory. I just nodded, my throat too tight to answer. As the weeks passed, I realized justice doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes, it comes softly. In the stillness after the storm. When the truth finally has space to breathe. I had spent so long drowning in grief, thinking love was something that died with the people who gave it. But standing beside my son, hearing the hum of that old engine flicker back to life, I knew better. Love doesn't end. It transforms. It protects. My husband's plan wasn't revenge. It was a gift. A final act of faith in the family he left behind. And as I watched Daniel tighten the last bolt on the Mustang, I whispered to myself that maybe, after everything, this was how healing begins. Not with justice served, but with love remembered. Daniel moved back home quietly. No grand announcement. No ceremony. Just a single suitcase and a hesitant knock on the same door he'd walked through his whole life. For weeks, our conversations were sparse. Built mostly on small exchanges, coffee ready in the morning. Dinner waiting at 7. Lights left on in the kitchen when one of us couldn't sleep. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It felt like soil after rain. Soft. Open. Ready for something to grow. Every day carried its own kind of healing. Sometimes, that healing looked like shared laughter over a burnt pie. Other times, it was just sitting together at the dining table. Both of us lost in thought, but grateful to be lost together. The air in the house changed slowly. The grief didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip, making room for something gentler. Daniel started spending time at Tom Harris's garage. At first, he said it was just to keep busy. But I knew better. I'd see the same look in his eyes that I once saw in his father's. Focus. Patience. The quiet satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. Tom told me Daniel was learning fast. His hands steady and his heart finally finding direction again. The Mustang became their shared project. The same car that once symbolized betrayal now stood for redemption. Every new coat of paint, every part polished and restored, seemed to heal something invisible between us. The first time I saw it running again, engine humming low and steady, I cried without realizing it. It wasn't just the sound of a machine coming back to life. It was the sound of a promise being kept. When Daniel finally asked me to take a drive, it was a soft spring morning. The air smelled of lilacs. The sky just beginning to brighten. I slid into the passenger seat. And for a moment, I felt as if time had folded in on itself. Like I was sitting beside both my husband and my son at once. The seat creaked the same way it used to. And when the engine started, it filled the quiet with something that felt like grace. We drove without speaking. Past the church where I'd married his father. Past the diner where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings. Past the oak-lined road that led home again. I caught Daniel glancing at me in the mirror. And I saw it. That flicker of peace. Fragile but real. For the first time in years, I believed we were going to be okay. That afternoon, he gave away the silver watch Clara had once gifted him. The last remnant of her influence. He told me he wanted someone else to have it. Someone who might still believe it meant something good. He started volunteering at the local trade school soon after, helping young mechanics learn what his father once taught him, that building something with your hands can rebuild your heart too. And me, I found myself smiling again. Not the way I used to. Not without the ache that lingers, but with the quiet understanding that love changes shape. My husband's presence is everywhere. In the low rumble of that engine, in the warmth of the morning light, in the steadiness of Daniel's laughter. He isn't gone. He's just changed form. The way light does when it passes through glass. If I've learned anything, it's that real revenge isn't about destruction. It's about truth. It's about love surviving where deceit tried to bury it. Living well. Fully. Freely. Without bitterness. That's the greatest justice there is. So if you've ever lost something precious, or felt betrayed by someone you trusted, I want you to remember this. The story doesn't end where the pain begins. It ends when you choose to heal. It ends when love, in whatever form it takes, finally wins. If this story touched you, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear it that healing isn't weakness. It's proof that love always finds a way back. When I think back to where this all began, the morning I stood in that cold kitchen, staring at the open garage door, it feels like another lifetime. I remember the weight in my chest, the confusion, the disbelief. I thought that day was the end of everything I'd built, the end of love as I knew it. But time has a way of softening sharp edges, and truth, when faced with courage, has a way of turning loss into light. Now, when I step into that same garage, the air smells of oil and polish again. The Mustang gleams under the sunlight, and the same way it used to when my husband was alive. Only now, it's my son's hands that keep it shining. It's strange how something once stolen could return as a gift, carrying forgiveness instead of pain. Love changes. It doesn't fade. It doesn't It transforms. It finds new ways to live through us, even when we think we have nothing left to give. I used to believe justice was about making things right, but now I understand it's about finding peace in the truth. Real revenge isn't in punishment. It's in choosing love when bitterness would be easier. It's in living well, quietly, honestly, without hate. If you've listened this far, maybe you've carried your own kind of hurt. A betrayal. A goodbye that still echoes. I want you to know you're not alone. Healing takes time. But it comes. It always comes. If this story meant something to you, share it. Leave a thought below. About love, forgiveness, or the ways you found your way back to peace. Maybe your story will help someone else start healing too. Thank you for listening. Truly. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you find the kind of love that never leaves, only changes shape.